The Roman Empire gave the modern world concrete, aqueducts, and the foundations of the legal system. It sounds like the ideal society of a victorious civilization, doesn't it? But beneath this glittering historical facade lay a system that is simply blood-curdling today. It turns out that Roman laws protected their citizens even at the moment of their own brutal execution. The Romans turned the death penalty into a complex political tool, where social status determined the method of departure from life. It sounds insane, but for them, it was just the cold, hard math of power. Today, everyone is formally equal before the law, regardless of passport or position. In ancient Rome, equality was considered a silly joke for naive Greek philosophers. Your citizenship was literally an impenetrable shield that saved you from the most humiliating forms of public execution. Imagine a modern prison where your living conditions depend on whether you have a city residency permit. The Romans went much further and decided that even different classes should die in different ways. Now let's recall the famous Roman army, which conquered half the known world. Their discipline was not based solely on good pay and the prospect of veterans receiving land grants. It was rooted in a primal fear of punishment, which was meted out to entire units that had committed offenses. We're talking about decimation, when every 10th soldier had to die at the hands of his own comrades. In a modern office, you might lose your bonus for poor performance, but in Rome, your co-workers could stone you to death. In this video, we'll examine the most shocking methods of the Roman justice system. We'll find out why being thrown to wild beasts wasn't the worst possible outcome. You'll understand the logic of the people who built the greatest empire in human history through control over others' lives. Modern security systems will seem like kindergarten compared to the methods of the Roman legions. Fasten your seatbelts because we're heading into a very dark era. I promise that after this story, you'll start to appreciate your boring modern life much more. Your strict boss will suddenly seem like the sweetest and kindest person on the entire planet. The Romans left us many great inventions, but their judicial system elicits only a nervous laugh. We've grown accustomed to admiring their marble statues and forget the blood that soaks the foundations of these cities. Let's take off this beautiful mask and look true Roman justice in the eye. The Romans loved law and order more than a good fight in the gladiatorial arena. They filled tons of papyrus to regulate every little detail of their restless fellow citizens' lives. But to a modern person, their codes would seem like a collection of horror movie scripts. The fact is, their system lacked the concept of basic human rights. Your worth was determined solely by a piece of paper confirming your membership in the noble class. Being a Roman citizen meant wearing invisible armor against state arbitrariness. Local magistrates couldn't just grab you off the street and throw you in jail without good cause. You had the right to a public trial, lawyers, and the opportunity to defend your honor in the face of your accusers. Today, this is called the presumption of innocence, but back then, it was an incredible luxury. The rest of the empire's inhabitants could not have imagined such privileges even in their wildest dreams. Imagine a situation where, for stealing an apple, you could legally be fed to hungry bears. But if you have a citizen's passport, for the same crime, you'd simply be handed a hefty fine. It sounds like a wild injustice that makes you want to take to the streets immediately. However, the Romans considered this gradation of punishments the crowning achievement of their intellectual and social evolution. They sincerely believed that noble blood made a person physically and morally superior to others. That is precisely why any form of torture was prohibited for citizens during judicial inquiries. A slave could be beaten for hours to extract the testimony the investigator needed. Torturing a citizen, however, was strictly forbidden, even if he was clearly hiding an important state secret. Modern police operate under uniform rules for everyone, at least in civilized countries. In Rome, however, justice functioned like an elite nightclub with very strict entry requirements. But what happened when a citizen committed something truly terrible and unforgivable? He too had to be executed, but it had to be done with the utmost respect. The Romans did not want to tarnish their nation's image with public outcries and humiliating displays by the elite. Therefore, for such cases, they used a quick and relatively clean beheading with a sword. Snap, and your problem is solved without unnecessary fuss or loss of dignity for the ruling class. The executioner carried out his work quickly so that onlookers wouldn't have time to revel in the suffering of a respected man. In the Middle Ages, beheading was also considered a privilege of kings and the highest aristocracy. It turns out that the Romans established this strange trend of an elite death many centuries before European monarchs. My neck starts to itch nervously at the very thought of such a medical procedure. But for an ancient Roman, it was the best way to leave this cruel world. Of course, this system broke down during the reigns of mad emperors like Caligula or Nero. These guys loved to break the rules and could execute a senator just for the sake of a fun evening show. But such cases shocked society and were considered a monstrous violation of sacred traditions. Under normal circumstances, the law ran like a Swiss watch, sorting people by their level of importance. And this cynical approach allowed the empire to keep millions of conquered peoples in check. The funny thing is that many tribes themselves sought to obtain the coveted Roman citizenship. They were willing to serve in the army for 25 years just to get that magical tablet. People literally gave up their best years for the right to be executed in a decent manner. Modern migrants seek to go abroad for high salaries and social benefits. Ancient warriors went to Rome for the right to avoid a painful death on a wooden cross. This fact speaks volumes about the times in which they had to survive. The world was such a dangerous place that the guarantee of a quick death was considered an excellent social perk. Roman lawyers fully understood the value of their offer and did not hand out passports left and right. Citizenship was an elite club, open only to those most loyal and useful to the state, and they did everything in their power to protect the exclusivity of this club, using death as their main argument. As a result, we see a society where justice did not serve the pursuit of abstract truth. It functioned as a tool of social control and a constant reminder of your place in the food chain. You could be an incredibly wealthy merchant from a distant eastern province, but without citizen status, any Roman official could send you to the block simply because he was in a bad mood. Remember this the next time you complain about the injustice of modern courts. Crucifixion is considered the most famous method of execution in human history, thanks to religion. Many people think that the Romans crucified everyone indiscriminately, from petty thieves to dangerous political rivals. In reality, it was an exclusive procedure devised specifically to intimidate non-citizens. The very word cross was considered so indecent that Roman politicians tried not to utter it in polite society. It was an ancient equivalent of profanity, used only against the very lowest of society. Why did the cross in particular inspire such panic and horror throughout the ancient world? Because this execution was designed so that the person would die as slowly and painfully as possible. No vital organs were damaged, so that the victim could endure several days under the scorching sun. The person literally suffocated under the weight of their own body, trying to support themselves on legs pierced by nails. Modern medicine calls this asphyxia, and the Romans called it an excellent lesson for the rebellious. The main purpose of crucifixion was not at all the physical destruction of a specific criminal. The Roman authorities wanted to completely destroy a person's identity, stripping them of even the slightest remnants of human dignity. The victim was displayed completely naked at the intersection of major roads, so that every passerby could throw a stone or hurl an insult. It was akin to the cancellation culture of the modern internet, only instead of angry comments, you were physically nailed to a tree. Cruelty here was not a side effect, but the very purpose of the entire event. For Roman citizens, this punishment was prohibited by law, even for treason against the homeland. The great orator Cicero said that the very idea of crucifying a Roman citizen was a crime against nature. If a magistrate dared to take such a step, he himself could be sent into exile for abuse of power. The authorities understood perfectly well that the humiliation of a single citizen automatically humiliated the entire ruling class of the empire. Therefore, crucifixions were generously meted out to slaves who had rebelled and to the inhabitants of conquered barbarian territories. The most famous instance of the mass use of this method is associated with the Spartacus uprising. When the Roman legions finally defeated the army of escaped slaves, they decided to stage a grand public spectacle. 6,000 people were crucified along the Appian Way over a distance of many kilometers. Imagine driving along a modern highway where, instead of streetlights, there are people tortured to death. It was a powerful message to every slave in Italy about what happens to dreams of freedom. Erecting a cross required certain engineering skills and a significant amount of wood. Forests were scarce in some regions, so wooden beams were often reused multiple times. Modern companies pride themselves on recycling waste, while the Romans reused execution tools. Executioners would simply remove the dead body and immediately nail the next candidate to the same piece of wood. This sounds repulsive, but military logistics always require maximum conservation of valuable resources. Relatives were forbidden from removing the bodies to bury them according to religious customs. In the ancient world, it was believed that the soul of an unburied person would be unable to find peace in the afterlife. In this way, the Romans punished a person not only in this life, but also in eternity. They literally robbed their enemies of their future by leaving their remains to be torn apart by wild birds and stray dogs. Even modern intelligence agencies rarely go to such lengths to exert psychological pressure on their adversaries. The very process of preparing for crucifixion was also part of a cruel theatrical spectacle. The condemned man was forced to carry a heavy crossbeam through the entire city to the site of his own death. This served as a preliminary punishment, designed to wear the person down even before the main procedure began. Today, we demand humane treatment even for the most dangerous serial killers in maximum security prisons. The Romans would have tapped their fingers against their temples upon hearing of such strange and soft-hearted concepts. Eventually, this method of execution became so widespread that it lost its original shocking power. Residents of some troubled provinces grew accustomed to seeing rows of crosses along the main trade routes. When death becomes a daily routine, it ceases to frighten truly hardened people. Perhaps that is why the empire was later forced to devise even more sophisticated ways to intimidate the population. The human psyche is capable of adapting to any nightmare if it is shown too often. But during the Republic's heyday, crucifixion served as the perfect instrument of social terror. It drew a clear line between those who ruled the world and those who served it. You might have forgotten to pay your taxes, but you never forgot the screams of the dying beyond the city walls. This system was sustained by fear, which was ingrained in the subconscious of every non-citizen from early childhood. And as long as that fear held sway, the Roman machine continued its relentless march across the planet. The Roman hierarchy of death functioned like a strict corporate ladder. Only descending it was excruciatingly painful. At the very bottom were the slaves, who could be killed in absolutely any way at the mere whim of their master. Just above them stood free non-citizens, destined for crucifixion or shipment to lead mines. At the top of this grim pyramid were full citizens, entitled to a swift beheading. This resembles modern air travel, where business-class passengers receive better service even in the event of a disaster. Why did the state expend so much effort sorting the condemned according to their social status? Because public executions served as the Romans' equivalent of television, the internet, and evening news broadcasts. Every death sentence was intended to convey to the masses a clear message about the immutability of the class system. If a common peasant were executed as quickly as a senator, the people might have come to believe in social equality. And for an empire built on strict hierarchy, such democratic ideas were more dangerous than any barbarian army. There was a rule that pregnant women could not be executed until their child was born. It sounds like a display of incredible humanism, uncharacteristic of these harsh conquerors of the ancient world. But in reality, the reason was purely pragmatic and had nothing to do with mercy. An unborn child was considered a potential taxpayer or a future slave who belonged to the great state. The Romans simply did not want to destroy valuable state property because of the foolishness of its negligent mother. For those who committed treason, there was a special punishment known as the Curse of Oblivion. A person was not merely killed physically, but all mention of them was erased from all official documents. Statues were smashed, names on marble plaques were worn down to holes, and relatives were forbidden from mourning the deceased. Today, we call this a shadow ban on social media, when a person simply vanishes from the information sphere. In ancient times, this meant you were erased from history itself, as if you had never been born. Sometimes emperors used executions as a way to replenish the state budget during times of crisis. A wealthy senator could be accused of conspiracy, quickly executed, and all his vast lands confiscated for the treasury. It was an incredibly effective way to solve financial problems without having to raise taxes on the common people. Modern governments devise complex bond issuance schemes to plug holes in their budgets. Roman rulers simply opened the lists of the wealthiest people and sent a detachment of armed praetorians to them. Interestingly, the profession of executioner in ancient Rome was considered extremely shameful and socially unacceptable. These people were forbidden to live within the city limits and even to visit public baths alongside respectable citizens. They were considered unclean, even though they were merely carrying out official orders from respected judges and politicians. This is classic hypocrisy. Society watches executions with relish, but despises the one who delivers the blow. Your job may be dirty, but you're unlikely to be banished from the city for performing your professional duties. For women of high society, there were also their own special, less public ways of ending their lives. Most often, they were simply ordered to take their own lives in the comfort of their own homes to avoid unnecessary scandal. They might slit their wrists in a warm bath or drink poison while discussing philosophy with close friends. This was considered a noble way out of a difficult situation, one that preserved the family's honor and a portion of their property. By Roman standards, receiving an order to commit a neat suicide was almost a state compliment. The location for executions was also chosen not by chance, but according to strict urban planning rules. These were usually places outside the sacred city limits, so as not to desecrate the abode of the gods. The blood of criminals was to be spilled where wild nature began and civilization ended. Modern prisons are also often built far from residential areas, so as not to disturb impressionable citizens. The Romans did the same, only they were guided not by concern for people's nerves, but by strict religious fanaticism. When the hierarchy of death broke down, it led to mass riots and popular unrest. If a magistrate accidentally had a Roman citizen crucified, the crowd could tear the judge himself to pieces right on the street. People were willing to endure high taxes, corruption, and constant wars on the empire's borders, but they never forgave violations of the invisible class boundaries in matters of life and death. This was the very red line that even the most influential and powerful politicians dared not cross. Ultimately, this hierarchy reflected the very spirit of ancient Roman civilization. They believed in an order where every person had their place, their duty, and their ideal punishment. If you lived by the empire's rules, you would be killed cleanly and without unnecessary public humiliation. If you challenged the system, you will be turned into a bloody teaching aid for medical students, to the delight of the crowd. Cruel, cynical, but absolutely logical for people who were accustomed to measuring human lives in square miles of conquered territory. The Roman army was renowned for its incredible discipline, which allowed it to crush numerically superior enemies. This iron will of the legions was sustained not only by constant training, but also by total fear. The most terrifying punishment in the arsenal of Roman commanders was decimation, used for cowardice or mutiny by an entire unit. The essence of the method was that every 10th soldier in the offending cohort was executed by his own comrades. It sounds like a mad psychological experiment, but for ancient commanders, it was a harsh reality. How exactly did this gruesome process of selecting victims for a bloody public execution take place? Soldiers drew lots, and blind chance determined which of them would not live to see the next morning. No past merits, medals for bravery, or friendship with the commander could save you from the short straw. It was a mathematically perfect punishment, where the probability of dying was exactly 10% for every soldier. Modern lotteries offer you a chance to win money, but the Romans offered a chance to save your own life. The most terrifying part was who exactly was tasked with carrying out this cruel sentence. The execution was carried out by the very 9 men who were lucky enough to draw the winning ticket in this lottery of death. They had to beat their tentmate to death with heavy wooden clubs or pelt him with large stones. Imagine your boss forcing you to beat up a colleague you had lunch with just yesterday. For a Roman soldier, that colleague was the man who had covered his back in a brutal battle the day before. Why did the command force soldiers to kill their own friends and loyal comrades in arms? Because decimation was aimed not so much at punishing the guilty as at destroying collective solidarity. If a unit had banded together to rebel against a general, it was necessary to destroy trust within that group forever. Once you had stoned your friend to death, you would never again be able to trust the people standing next to you. The surviving soldiers were turned into broken automatons who feared their neighbors more than enemy blades. Those lucky enough to survive this meat grinder received neither forgiveness nor a comforting embrace from their superiors. They were deprived of their normal wheat rations and forced to eat cheap barley, which was usually given only to livestock. Furthermore, they were driven out of the safe, fortified camp and forced to sleep in the open. This was a mark of shame that could only be washed away with blood in the next extremely dangerous and grueling battle. Today, we send errant employees to training sessions, while the Romans sent them to sleep in the mud outside the camp. Interestingly, commanders used this method extremely rarely, understanding its devastating consequences for the army's morale. It was a sort of nuclear button in the arsenal of Roman management, pressed only in extreme cases. Marcus Licinius Crassus employed decimation during the war against Spartacus when his legions began to flee in panic. He showed his men that they had far more reason to fear a Roman commander than the army of rebellious slaves, and this cruel strategy proved entirely effective, transforming a crowd of cowards into a perfect killing machine. Modern team-building experts would go crazy trying to analyze this method of team cohesion. We're used to thinking that trust is built on group trips to the bar and team paintball games. The Romans, however, believed that true obedience arises where people are bound by shared bloodshed. They created an atmosphere of total paranoia in which the only safe path was blind obedience to orders. And the most astonishing thing is that this monstrous system actually won large-scale world wars. Some historians believe that the mathematical precision of decimation was a manifestation of the Romans' love for strict order. They did not slaughter the entire cohort because that would have been an irrational waste of valuable human resources. Killing 1 in 10 meant inflicting maximum psychological damage with minimal physical losses for the army. This is the cold calculation of a predator who knows how much pain to inflict so that the victim stops resisting. Your corporate fines for tardiness are mere child's play compared to the Roman optimization of discipline. In later times, the empire abandoned this method, recognizing it as too barbaric and destructive. Mercenary soldiers simply would not have tolerated such treatment and would have immediately defected to the enemy. Decimation worked only when the legions consisted of citizens who had nowhere to flee from their homeland. When the army became professional, commanders had to devise more subtle methods to maintain control over their troops. But the memory of this punishment has forever remained in history as a symbol of the army's absolute ruthlessness. The outcome of decimation was always the same. The unit would either perish in the next battle or achieve the impossible. The soldiers fought with the fury of the doomed, trying to prove their loyalty and wash away this shame. The Roman command got exactly what it wanted: fanatical fighters who had nothing left to lose. This is a lesson in how fear can become the most powerful fuel for human achievement on the battlefield. It is a pity, however, that the price of these achievements was measured in the shattered skulls of their own loyal soldiers. If you thought crucifixion was the limit of Roman imagination, then you simply haven't heard of the sack punishment. This execution was reserved exclusively for those who dared to kill their closest relatives. The Romans considered patricide the most terrible sin a sane person could commit. Simply beheading such a criminal seemed too banal and not humiliating enough a solution to the problem. so they devised a ritual that more closely resembled the drug-induced delirium of a mad ancient screenwriter. First, the criminal was brutally beaten with special rods painted blood red to heighten the dramatic effect. Then his head was wrapped in a wolfskin so he could not see the sunlight or the faces of honest citizens. Wooden stocks were placed on his feet, completely depriving him of the ability to resist the subsequent insane procedures. In this state, the condemned man was shoved into a huge leather sack, which was usually used for transporting grain. My brain starts to panic at this stage, but for the Romans, this was merely preparation. Now begins the strangest and most shocking part of this ancient form of state justice. Along with the man, 4 living and very unhappy creatures were placed into this narrow leather sack. These were a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a poisonous snake, which had been captured in advance for the procedure. Why on earth would anyone think to gather this strange menagerie in a single dark and cramped space? Each of these animals had its own specific symbolic role in the Roman mythological framework. The dog was considered an unclean animal, symbolizing contempt and the absolute loss of respect in society. The rooster was thrown in as a symbol of madness and rage, which drives a man to kill his own father. The snake personified cunning, meanness, and betrayal of one's own blood, which violated the sacred laws of nature. But with the monkey, things are much more complicated, since these animals were not native to Italy and had to be brought in specially. The monkey symbolized a caricature of a human, a creature that looks like a person but is devoid of a human soul. Imagine the atmosphere inside that leather sack in the first few minutes after it was tightly sewn shut. Darkness, a lack of air, the panic of animal terror, and 5 creatures that begin to tear at each other in a frenzy. The snake bites the dog, the rooster pecks at the monkey, and the man tries to protect his face from claws and fangs. It was a veritable biological meat grinder, staged in the square for the sake of celebrating Roman justice. Today, animal rights activists would wipe the empire off the face of the earth faster than any barbarians for such a thing. But the torture didn't end there, for the sack had to be disposed of along with its contents. It was loaded onto a cart drawn by black oxen and slowly driven to the nearest river or the deep sea. The Romans believed that the criminal had defiled himself so thoroughly that he had no right to touch pure soil. The leather sack served as a barrier, protecting the sacred soil of Rome from the defilement of this monstrous man. In the end, this screaming leather ball was simply thrown into the water, where it slowly sank to the bottom. Why were they so afraid of defiling the earth with the blood of a man who had killed his own father? Roman culture was based on an absolute cult of ancestors and respect for the eldest in the family. A father had power over the life and death of his children, so to raise a hand against him meant challenging the gods themselves. The state had to respond so harshly that the very thought of such a crime would induce physical nausea. And, judging by surviving records, this insane theatrical spectacle did an excellent job of fulfilling its preventive purpose. The logistics of this execution raise some questions among modern historians and scholars of antiquity. Where did the magistrates of small provincial towns obtain live monkeys for every case of patricide? Most likely, in remote regions, the recipe for this gruesome cocktail was simplified somewhat, making do with local wild animals. But in Rome itself, this execution was carried out strictly according to instructions to demonstrate the capital's wealth and power. Modern bureaucracies sometimes fail to deliver paper to an office on time, yet the Romans managed to deliver monkeys for executions. In later periods of the empire, this method gradually fell out of widespread legal favor. Emperor Constantine replaced the animals with ordinary poisonous snakes, deciding to save a little money on the exotic menagerie. Later, the sack was abandoned altogether, replaced by burning alive or sending the condemned to deadly gladiatorial games. But in the collective memory, this form of execution has forever remained the ultimate expression of the state's creative madness. Sometimes it seems that Roman lawyers were simply competing with one another to see who could devise the most brutal punishment. This example perfectly illustrates how vastly different the thinking of ancient people was from ours. For us, justice means isolating the criminal from society and attempting to reform them. For the Romans, Justice was a cosmic ritual of purifying the universe of nature's mistake at any cost. They did not try to reform a person, they tried to erase them from reality in the most spectacular way possible, and a sack of wild animals was perfectly suited for this noble purpose. We are accustomed to viewing the Colosseum and other amphitheaters as venues for ancient sporting competitions. Gladiatorial combat did indeed draw huge crowds, but it was merely the final part of the day's entertainment program. The most interesting and brutal spectacle took place at exactly noon, when the respectable audience sat down to dine. It was at this very time that the arena turned into a giant state scaffold for mass public executions. It was the ancient equivalent of an entertainment show playing in the background during a family meal. One of the most popular forms of midday punishment was the so-called throwing to the wild beasts. Criminals were led out onto the arena's sand, completely naked and stripped of any weapons for self-defense. Then, hungry lions, tigers, bears, or even specially trained wild boars were released from underground chambers. Spectators enthusiastically placed bets on how long a particular person could outrun the enraged predator. Modern reality shows try to shock us with participants' arguments, while the Romans watched real dismemberment live on air. To make the show even more exciting, organizers often devised elaborate theatrical sets. The arena could be planted with real trees, imitating a dense forest where the criminal was to play the role of a mythological hero. Sometimes people were strapped to special mechanisms that lifted them into the air just before a hungry leopard pounced. This required incredible work from engineers who labored on the stage mechanics day and night. The Empire's brilliant minds wasted their potential on making someone's death more photogenic. For the spectators, this was not a manifestation of a savage thirst for blood or primitive psychopathy, as it might seem today. In their eyes, it was an act of restoring universal justice, where evil was destroyed by nature itself. The beasts acted as impartial judges, simply purging Roman society of dangerous scum. Therefore, the crowd in the stands felt no sympathy for the terrified people screaming on the sand. If you found yourself in the arena, it meant the law had found you guilty, and now you were merely a prop for the show. Where did the Empire get such an incredible number of exotic animals for its regular performances? Entire legions of soldiers were engaged in capturing animals in North Africa and the Middle East to supply the capital. It was a business of colossal proportions, involving sums of money comparable to the budgets of modern corporations. Because of the Romans' insatiable appetite for this form of entertainment, the populations of certain feline species in North Africa were virtually wiped out. The Roman legal system literally altered the ecology of an entire continent for the sake of high-quality entertainment. Fugitive slaves, deserters, and people accused of practicing black magic could end up in the arena with the beasts. Later, the first Christians, who refused to offer sacrifices to the official Roman gods, were added to this same category. To the state, they were not martyrs for their faith, but dangerous rebels undermining the foundations of the social order. Therefore, their deaths were meant to serve as a vivid lesson for anyone who doubted the emperor's authority. The blood of these people literally soaked into the sand, entertaining tens of thousands of loyal citizens. Sometimes unexpected mishaps occurred when the animals refused to attack the people thrown to them. A lion that was full or frightened by the noise of the crowd might simply lie down in a corner of the arena and fall asleep amid the whistles of disappointed spectators. In such cases, the trainers who had failed to prepare the beasts faced severe punishment, even death. The organizer of the games could not afford to disappoint the crowd, for his political career depended on it. The show had to go on at any cost, even if it meant killing the amphitheater's own staff. In addition to wild animals, the arena also hosted so-called theatrical executions based on famous myths. A person might be forced to put on wings and be thrown from a high tower, imitating Icarus's ill-fated flight. Another might be burned at the stake in a Hercules costume, forced to writhe in pain to the applause of the intellectuals. It was a perverted form of educational programming, where mythology came to life in the bloodiest hues. Modern theatre tries to stir our emotions through the actors' performances, while Roman theatre did so using real corpses. This entire system functioned as a perfect mechanism for venting social tension in overcrowded cities. Poor and hungry citizens could feel like the elite simply by deciding the fate of a criminal in the arena with the flick of a finger. Emperors gave the crowd the illusion of power, allowing them to shout their demands from the high spectator stands. It was the most effective antidepressant of the ancient world, costing the state millions of sesterces. Better for the crowd to watch blood in the arena than to spill the blood of patricians on the streets of Rome. Today, the ruins of these amphitheaters attract millions of tourists from around the world, taking happy selfies. We marvel at the arches, columns, and ingenious architecture of these grandiose ancient structures, but we rarely stop to think that every stone here is steeped in industrialized death. Roman justice turned murder into a high art, making it the main entertainment of the great empire. And this is perhaps the most shocking fact about the civilization that gave us modern law. Summing up our grim journey through the pages of Roman criminal law, one feels the urge to take a deep breath. We have seen a civilization that was brilliant in its construction and utterly ruthless in its jurisprudence. They devised laws that protected the rights of the elite and executions that kept everyone else in terror. Crucifixion, decimation, and a sack of wild animals. These are not merely manifestations of ancient barbarism and ignorance. They were carefully designed instruments of political control, created by the outstanding minds of their harsh era. The Romans understood one simple thing that modern, peace-loving politicians often forget. True power is based on a monopoly on violence and the ability to make that violence as spectacular as possible. When you view an execution through the lens of modern humanism, it seems like a senseless bloodbath. But for a Roman senator, it was an excellent way to send a message to the empire's most remote provinces. It was the language of power that absolutely everyone understood, from a wild Celtic warrior to an educated Egyptian priest. The hierarchy of death served as a reliable glue that held this gigantic and diverse empire together. If you were a citizen, you were guaranteed the privilege of a clean departure from life by the stroke of a steel sword. If you were a stranger, you would slowly suffocate on a wooden cross under the scorching southern sun. This simple and brutal system of incentives made millions of people dream of obtaining a Roman passport. No modern benefits or tax deductions could compare to the right to avoid a shameful death in the arena. Most strikingly, many principles of this system continued to live on in modified forms even after the fall of Rome. Medieval monarchs adopted the idea of public executions as a way to communicate with the uneducated masses. The distinction between a noble beheading and a shameful hanging persisted in Europe well into the 20th century. It turns out that Roman jurists laid the foundation not only for our civil codes, but also for our cruelty. They taught the world that justice must be not only blind, but also very loud. Today, we live in a world where corporal punishment is considered barbaric and a violation of basic human rights. We hide our prisons behind high fences and try not to think about what happens inside. The Romans, on the other hand, put their justice on display, making it the center of the city's public life. They didn't hide death, they put it on display in the window of their mighty ancient supermarket. It sounds wild, but there was far less hypocrisy in their approach than in some modern institutions. When we read about decimation or sacks of snakes, we can't help but feel our moral superiority. It seems to us that we have evolved, becoming smarter, kinder, and more humane than our distant ancestors. But it's worth remembering that the Romans also considered themselves the pinnacle of civilizational development compared to the barbarians surrounding them. Their cruelty was not a random glitch in the system, but a logical response to the challenges of their harsh era. Perhaps 2,000 years from now, our descendants will be just as horrified by our modern methods of problem solving. Studying these dark pages of history helps us better understand the nature of human society and the state. It is an excellent antidote to the excessive romanticization of the past, a sin modern Hollywood directors are so fond of committing. Behind the beautiful togas, marble forums, and grand philosophical speeches always stood the crosses and the blood-soaked sand of the arena. Without this fear, the empire would not have lasted even a couple of decades, collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Order always demands sacrifices, and the Romans simply elevated this principle to an absolute mathematical constant. I hope this video has made you look at the familiar image of ancient Rome from school textbooks in a new light. We're used to admiring their roads, but we forget about those who were crucified along those very roads. History is rarely black and white. More often than not, it's tinged with shades of dried blood and cold marble. The deeper we dig, the more terrifying secrets modern archaeologists uncover in ancient archives. And each of these secrets makes the picture of the past more vivid, frightening, and incredibly fascinating to study. If you enjoyed this dive into the brutal world of Roman justice, be sure to let us know. There are still many dark corners in history that the compilers of boring academic encyclopedias are afraid to explore. We can discuss insane taxes, strange medical practices, or how ordinary people survived back then. The past still hides many shocking secrets, waiting for their moment to surprise the modern viewer. After all, real history always turns out to be far crazier and cooler than any fictional sci-fi series. Your modern, boring job and strict laws are a true gift from fate, believe me. The next time you get a parking ticket, think about hungry lions and a leather bag with a monkey inside. Life in the 21st century definitely has its significant advantages, which we often fail to notice. Appreciate your mundane daily life, enjoy your safety, and remember that history loves to repeat itself in new forms. Thank you for your attention, stay curious, and see you next time as we delve into the mysteries of our past.